tackle the essential role of quality auditing examination offices for EU plant variety rights. And for this, we have a guest with us today, who is Sergio Simon. It's a pleasure for us to being able to collaborate with you, Sergio, for the first time, and we're very happy that you have accepted our invitation and we had the chance to organize this webinar. Now we can also see your video again. A very warm welcome to you too. Now, nice to meet also from our audience. I will now show you my screen very quickly, because if you followed one of our previous webinars, you probably know that I'm going to steal a couple of minutes from the main presentation in order to introduce to you to the services of the European IP help desk, and explain, especially to those of you who are being with us for the first time, what we are and what we do as well. So starting from my person, physical person, of course, my name is Michele Dubini and I'm part of the European IP Help Desk training team for a few years now. Today, I will be your technical assistant. So in case you've got problems of audio or video, do not hesitate to write these problems or your uncertainties in the question part of the screen. And I will be more than happy to help you with any form of difficulties you might encounter. Secondly, you might have noticed that your audio has been turned off. This is not a technical problem, but it is actually wanted, and that is because we would like our speaker to be as comfortable as possible and eliminate all background noises. That does not mean, however, you're not allowed to ask questions. You're actually very welcome to do so, and you can do this in the question part of the screen that you've got on the right-hand side of your screen. I will take a look periodically to this part of the GoToWebinar, and I will gather all the questions, and we're going to leave 10-15 minutes at the end of the webinar in order to answer to all these questions. The first and most frequently asked question that we receive is that when are we going to receive our recording of the presentation and the PDF slides? That is going to happen tomorrow morning at the latest. We're going to cut them and then send all the presentations and useful documents in a follow-up email for you to be received as soon as possible, of course. Now, having said that, the GDPR regulation also obliges me to inform you all that the presentation is going to be recorded. However, that is only for your own good, and we actually do that for you in order to provide you the advantage of being able to see the presentation at any moment after the webinar has taken place. Then, I will now turn my attention to the European IP Help Desk. We are a service initiative of the European Commission that has the main objective of helping mainly small and medium enterprises, researchers, and European Union funded projects in order to understand and use intellectual property and intellectual property rights. I said mainly because those three categories are our main target group, in the sense that statistically they are the ones that mainly use our services. However, anyone, juridical or physical person, is free to take advantage of any of the services that we offer, which, by the way, are the ones you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, starting from the website. The website, ec.europa.eu/ip-helpdesk, is the cornerstone of all the services, and from this website you are going to have access to all the different other clouds that you can see also on the right-hand side of the screen. So that we are going to provide you free of charge useful trainings online and on site. As you can imagine, from 2020, most likely online because of the impossibility of meet each other, and also the fact that it could probably be dangerous. However, our online offer has expanded, and one of these expansion is actually being about plant varieties, and today's webinar is an example of this and the new cooperation that we have started mainly with the Plant Variety Office of the European Union, but also with the European Patent Office and the European Union Intellectual Property Observatory and office in Alicante. We also provide publications online which are downloadable and useful and usable for you without any charge. And also we have an ambassador scheme, which I will describe later, and a helpline that is going to answer directly to all your queries regarding intellectual property and intellectual property rights. We also have siblings around the world, so the services that I have introduced right now are aimed at the European Union territory, but if you have questions regarding, for example, how to register other intellectual property rights around the world, mainly in China, India, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America, our siblings, as I said, are the ones that you should contact. They offer the very same services that I have explained now for the European Union, but with a different geographical area, depending, of course, the ones they are responsible for. So I told you there's a website, training, publications, the helpline as well. We also are active on YouTube, on audiovisual content, and on social medias as well, like on Twitter and LinkedIn. We have active an ambassador scheme around the European Union. Ambassadors are the ones who help us access the different territories of the European Union and different countries and overcome the language barriers that they might be. They are a very important pillar of the European IP help desk, and in case you'd like to check, they might be very near to your locations. On our website there's a whole map showing where they are and how to contact them. I told you there are other webinars available. Here they are for the first part of 2022. And if you'd like to register, you're very welcome to do so. Also, if you have missed one of the previous webinars in February, for example, you can simply request to have access to them, and we are going to provide you access as soon as possible with a link that you can use in order to stream the webinar at any time. There are many further initiatives that you can access in order to improve your intellectual property knowledge or use your intellectual property that you have generated. Here are some examples of it with links. You can reach all the different initiatives in case you'd like to explore the possibility that they offer. Also, a couple of these details more regarding ourselves, if you'd like to contact us. And with this, I have exhausted my time, and I'm not going to bother you anymore for the whole duration of the webinar. I will now provide the word to our main speaker, Sergio Sermon, and he is going to show you the technical slide and the main content of today's webinar, just like we tried before. Sergio, I can see your screen. I could hear your voice before, so I think we are quite set to go. Thank you very, very much once again for being with us, and I'll leave you the word.
Well, thank you very much, Michele, for that nice introduction and your kind words. And welcome everyone today to my webinar, which is on the essential role of quality auditing examination officers for EU plant variety rights. I see we have several attendants from around the world, not just from the EU. So it's good to see that you've all been interested in this particular webinar. I also saw some friendly names, people I know as well, and who I may actually be visiting on these quality audits later in the year. So it's good to see that you're getting yourselves prepared. Here in where we're based in Angers, it's a very nice sunny day. So I hope it's also the case where you are listening to me today. So for those of you who do not know what the CPVO is for a start, because the CPVO is an EU agency, which is the guardian and which administers the whole European Union plant variety right system. It's one of these decentralized agencies of the EU. We've been operational for 27 years now, since 1995. And for the last 25 years, we've been based in Angers, in France, which is a city in northwest France, not too far off from the Atlantic. Here you can see our very nice building, and just like in the photograph, we're enjoying a very nice sunny winter's day today, although the flowers as such, they're not yet in bloom. Just to explain what we do, our mission statement is to deliver and promote an efficient intellectual property rights system that supports the creation of new plant varieties for the benefit of society. So when breeders, we call them breeders, they're like inventors, they create a new plant variety, they have the option to protect it by intellectual property rights in order to have control over the variety. It's a sui generis system, which means that it's been specifically designed for plant varieties, and we operate this system on a regional level in the 27 member states of the European Union. Although there are many other countries around the world that have similar plant variety rights systems, and they're all overseen by an umbrella organization called UPOV, which is based at the YPO building in Geneva. As regards the service for which I am responsible for, which is for quality audit, this is an independent service of the CPVO, which was established about a dozen years ago, which would oversee the competence and the adherence to the CPVO's working principles of our various examination offices. And in order to achieve that, they have to adhere by a set of rules, and then we would give them entrustment or accreditation in order to be able to carry out our technical examinations. The service itself is directly under the responsibility of the Administrative Council of the CPVO. So our Administrative Council is made up of representatives of each member state of the European Union. And then it also has an audit advisory board, which is in case our examination officers are not happy with the findings of the QAS, they can file a kind of an appeal to the advisory board who will oversee whether the procedure was carried out properly. On a daily basis, the QAS is manned by just one person, by me, actually. I'm the QAS team leader. Although I don't do all the work by myself, I rely upon a pool of 36 technical experts who are external to the CPVO, and they are provided on a voluntary basis from our network of examination offices. So the examination offices, we have to use them in order to carry out our technical examinations. When the CPVO was created 27 years ago, it was decided that it shouldn't carry out its own trials, but instead it should delegate that responsibility to the member states and to the examination facilities that already existed in the member states with their different examination offices. So each of these examination offices, they have to carry out a specific scientific test called a test for DUS, which is distinctness, uniformity, and stability. And based on that test, a variety is declared to be DUS, so distinct, uniform, or stable, or not DUS. For example, if there's a variety that exists which is already too similar to the candidate variety. In most cases, the CPVO can rely upon these examination centers within the EU, but in a few rare cases where no testing facilities are available for a particular species in the EU, then we can rely on the expertise from other countries. So I will also talk in detail about that particular section when we have to rely upon examination offices outside the European Union. So here I'll show you how we are organized within the CPVO. The core of the CPVO you can find here. Also, we've just had a recently nominated president, Francesco Mattina, who's of a legal background. And we are separated into 4 main areas. The technical unit, which looks into the receipt of the applications and organizes and collaborates all the technical examinations with our examination offices. We have an administrative unit who also deals with finances, because we're a fully financed agency. We receive no subsidies at all from the Commission, so we have to run our own balanced budget. We have an IT unit. Obviously, information technology is becoming more and more important, particularly now with COVID times. And we also have a legal and procurement service, which provides support for the other services in general. But then you see here to the left that the quality audit service is kind of a free electron. You can see that it doesn't answer directly to the main presidency channels here, but instead it answers directly to the Administrative Council. And that's very important because it was decided that the quality audit service should be fully independent and they shouldn't be influenced at all by the other units or services from the CPVO. So I'm my own, sorry, excuse me, I'm my own boss in a way, which gives me some freedom to operate, although I have to report from time to time to the presidency to make them aware of various developments in the area. But when I make my reports and when I make my progress developments and so on, I report directly to the Administrative Council. I talked earlier about the QAS Technical Experts. So you see here a photograph of us all. Because every 3 years or so, with the start of a new cycle, everyone gets together and we go through a training for a couple of days. It's also a time to build rapport with each other, get to know each other better, because we're going to have to be working as teams during the course of the forthcoming cycle. Many of these experts are also going to be audited themselves. So for them, it's advantageous because if they're part of a team for a particular audit, they can also learn from it for the day they will be audited themselves. So it's a two-way learning process. And it's also good to build bridges with your fellow colleagues, because at some time in the future, you may have to be face-to-face with them and auditing them in person. So here I am, and you can see there's quite a varied cross-section of people from all over Europe, from all over our examination offices, and we have a good also balance of male and female colleagues. So what is auditing? Well, it's a structured independent assessment to find evidence in order that you can afterwards come to an audit conclusion as to whether someone is performing according to a set of defined standards. This is carried out by various means, through interviews, through collecting information, through analyzing information, gathering further evidence, making questions, being there on the ground, and making pertinent questions according to what you're finding. So the aim of the whole QAS assessment program is to ensure that the test results we get from the QAS technical examinations are reliable, that they're comparable, and that they're repeatable. And in order to ensure that, the examination officers have to be able to demonstrate their competence in the way they're carrying out the work for the CPVO. This is also important because we need some harmonization, seeing as we work with dozens of examination officers throughout the European Union, and they have to work in a similar manner, because at the end of the day, the CPVO will be delivering a title of protection which is valid throughout the whole of the European Union. So we want to be safe in the knowledge that whether that reports comes from Italy, France, Spain, Estonia, wherever, is going to be of a similar quality, because we don't want to deliver titles which are inferior in quality or superior in quality, depending on where that DUS test is being carried out. So our approach to the problem was to establish a set of quality levels. In order to be able to establish these, we have to have clear criteria that is applicable to everyone. And for that, we have what's called entrustment requirements, which we'll be touching onto in more detail later on this presentation. In a way, it's like the kind of Bible by which our different examination officers have to adhere to. Then there's going to be a formal evaluation, and that is going to be done by the QAS team. So we take along our entrustment requirements and we analyze whether the examination officers are carrying out their work according to those entrustment requirements. And then a further approach which ensures independence is that the decision is taken by the different entity. So it's not going to be QAS that takes the decision on whether to entrust an examination office or not. That is done by the Administrative Council of the CPVO, which is the highest body or governing body of the CPVO. Seeing as that also is made up of representatives of each of the member states, we can ensure a neutrality on the entrustment decision. That decision is based upon a recommendation from QAS. Although the Administrative Council has all the information at hand, like the assessment reports, follow-up reports, and so on from the QAS team, to ensure that a sound, neutral, and concisive decision is going to be taken. And afterwards, if there are some complaints, in particular from the examination officers that are being audited, then we have the independent audit advisory board that can look into the recommendations or decisions of the Administrative Council. Now I will show you in a kind of flowchart way how this assessment exercise works. How it's all planned, how it's all structured. We have here the CPVO, and we have here our network of examination offices throughout the European Union. So on the one side, the network of examination offices, it provides expertise to the CPVO, because they're the ones carrying out the actual DUS technical examinations. So we have working groups every year between our examination offices and the CPVO to discuss developments in DUS testing. And at the same time, it also provides expertise to the QAS team. So this is where I am here. So the expertise that's been provided from the examination office network is via their QAS experts, because the QAS experts are employed on a daily basis by the network of examination offices, although when they're going to be working as part of the QAS team, then they're detached to the CPVO, to the QAS team, as if they were employees of the CPVO. At the same time, the CPVO defines the criteria by which the examination offices should be analyzed. So that's the entrustment requirements I mentioned earlier. So once a QAS team is assembled, then what we do is we go to each of the examination offices in turn and we evaluate whether they are performing their technical examination according to the defined criteria of the entrustment requirements. Once the mission takes place to the examination office, what happens then is that the QAS team has to draw up an assessment report and eventually follow-up report if there are non-conformities, and that is presented at a later stage to the Administrative Council through a recommendation, and it is then the Administrative Council that decides to entrust or not, or perhaps to give a reduced scope of entrustment to the examination office for a 3-year period. And then you see here by the side the Audit Advisory Board, which checks and advises the work of the QAS team if there were to be any complaints made on the way that the QAS team has performed. Now, fortunately, the Advisory Board has never had to sit formally. There was one occasion some years back where there was one examination office which wasn't so happy with the outcome of the evaluation, but the matter was resolved in the end and the Advisory Board did not have to sit. So in a way that gives a good thumbs up for the audit team, because in its 12 years of existence, we've carried out over 100 different audits to examination offices. So we're very proud of the fact that none of them so far have been formally addressed through an appeal. So now I will go in more detail into the entrustment requirements. That's set of clearly defined criteria by which the examination offices are going to be evaluated or judged, as you see in the cartoon here, because for the examination offices, it's sometimes a nervous time when we arrive, because we're going to evaluate to see their competence. But we try to put on a friendly face and we assure them that if everyone collaborates, things are going to go through smoothly. First, we'll give you an introduction to the entrustment requirements, how they're structured, the different chapters, and then I'll focus on the sections dealing more with the structural framework of the requirements, how they are obliged to also implement a quality system internally at the examination offices, and then the different technical capabilities which they have to have in place in order to conduct sound DUS tests. Behind all this, there's a legal framework, and for that we first have to look into the basic regulation of the CPVO, which is Regulation 2194 of the Council. And there are two articles, Article 55 and Article 56, which states that the CPVO has to ensure that the examination officers entrusted for the species carry out the DUS test in a correct manner. And these decisions on entrustment are decided upon by the CPVO as well as through internal instructions of the CPVO. Then moving on to the regulation, this is a Commission regulation 874/2009. That goes into more detail on the entrustment proceedings. And this regulation came about more or less at the same time as the QAS system also was implemented under the CPVO. And based upon this legal documentation, we then have the entrustment, the requirements themselves, the latest version of which came into force on the 15th of October of 2015. So it's just over 6 years old now, because in those 6 years, there are various changes which have happened. We need to take account of developments in breeding. We also need to take more and more into account issues like climate change and so on. And the result of that, at the moment, we're going through a revision process of the entrustment requirements so that we can have a new version available, an up-to-date version, which will come into force as from the beginning of next year. So the whole entrustment procedure, as well as the entrustment requirements themselves, can be found to any person, whether they're examination officers, other stakeholders, or anyone from the general public via the CPVO website. So you're all invited to look at those if you're interested. And the objective of those is to clearly lay out in 14 chapters the various criteria where the examination has to ensure that the QAS tests are carried out. There are three main areas to those entrustment requirements. There's the structural framework, which is laid out in chapters 1 to 8 and chapter 14, which is on the constitution of the examination office, how they work on a daily basis, how they're structured, and how they carry out their normal business. Then there's an implementation chapter, which establishes that they themselves also have to have a quality system, an internal audit, to make sure that there are internal checks on a regular basis on all the various operating areas. And finally, there's the technical capability chapters, which go more in depth as to how the actual technical examinations are being carried out, what kind of facilities they have to carry out those technical examinations, and importantly, which I will describe in more detail later, the variety collections they have to establish in order to make sure that they can make a proper declaration on distinctness of candidate varieties. So going more detail into the structural framework, chapter 3 goes into the internal organization of the examination offices. So that outlines whether they're part of a ministry, for example, a Ministry of Agriculture, or whether they're an autonomous body, how they receive their finance, whether it's from public finance or whether it's from fees. Then there's a chapter 4, which previous demonstrable experience means what experience they've had in working in species similar to the ones that they are entrusted for. Then chapters 5 and 6 are independence, integrity, and confidentiality, since we have to ensure that there will not be influences on the result of that TUS test. We must ensure that everything is neutral, and I'll go into this in more detail, that there may not be conflicts of interest, because otherwise it will put into question the whole technical examination. Then chapter 7 is cooperation with the CPVO, because the examination office has to deliver reports on a regular basis according to certain time schedules. Also, any problems during the US test have to be reported with the CPVO so that we can liaise together and also make the breeder aware of any difficulties which may be arising. Chapter 8 deals with the qualifications of the personnel, because the personnel have to be properly trained to ensure that they are able to perform US tests in the correct manner. Usually they have an agricultural or horticultural background, so we also need to see what the level of expertise is and whether they're making observations on plants in a correct manner. And then there's chapter 14 on subcontracting, because the examination office can subcontract out part or all of the US test itself to another third party. And for this, I will also talk about it in more detail to explain to you the different possibilities available for subcontracting for the examination office. As regards the independence, integrity, and confidentiality, we have to identify whether an EO is part of a ministry of an institute and whether that institute may be doing breeding activities themselves. Because if there is, there has to be a separation of tasks. Then there has to be a sufficient description of the scope of entrustment. We get situations where, for example, it may be a very large species, as is the case, for example, for maize, which can be grown in different parts of Europe, but you cannot always grow the same types of varieties of maize all over Europe. So there may be limitations on which types of varieties of maize any particular examination office can grow, and that is clearly defined in the scope of entrustment, which may be limited. And we have to ensure that the QAS testing staff is fully neutral and that they're not going to be influenced by anyone in the work they're carrying out, neither by their superiors, the management of the institute itself, or if the institute is carrying out breeding, that breeding effort is not going to have an influence on the results of the QAS tests for the candidate varieties, which I'll get into in more detail later on. So this neutrality implies that the examiners must have no involvement at all in breeding, in particular in breeding of the species for which that office is entrusted, nor the commercialization, nor the reproduction of the species which the examination office is entrusted. There has to be a clear documented procedure on that, because there are situations where examination offices do breeding on a species for which it is entrusted, and if that is the case, then they can lose their entrustment. However, there is possibility to have separation of tasks, and that has to be clearly outlined in an internal procedure, and we will also check as a QAS team that it is probably being adhered to, that there's no connection between the breeding arm of the institute and the DUS testing part of the institute. So conflict of interests is essential. We want to avoid a conflict of interest at all costs, because otherwise it will put into question the whole validity of a title of protection, and will put into question the seriousness of the whole system as well. So here we see possible conflicts of interest. Situations could be that there could be a partnership, for example, between the examination office and other external firms carrying out breeding activities. Or there could be research by the examination office itself, some more basic reading of starting material, which could eventually finish up as a variety in itself. Another situation could be the use of external experts who may have widespread knowledge about the species in question to help during the course of the QAS test. And all these possible situations may lead to a situation of risks through a lack of impartiality in evaluating the candidate variety, because they may want to pass the variety if it's something coming out from their own institute, or if it could be a potential competitor to varieties coming from that institute, then they may give a less favorable DUS report. We also have to ensure that the QAS test is done in a spirit of confidentiality. So the breeding scheme, the formula of the parents and so on, that's not divulged to third parties, nor should the plant material which has been submitted for DUS testing be used for other purposes. that plant material in the trial ground remains the property of the breeder. So that cannot be used for any other purpose than the US trial or subsequent entry into the variety collection. It cannot be used for propagation by the institute or third parties, nor can it be used to include in the research program of that institute or third parties. In order to avoid these possible conflicts of interests, we also have legal tools. We have these on the one side on the assignment contract. The assignment contract is the legal document between the CPVO and the examination office, which lays out the various rules by which one party needs to adhere and then the other as well. In a similar way to an employment contract, basically, you sign that, both parties sign that saying what you should do, what time schedules are to be adhered to, how much is going to be paid for examination office, etc. So this assignment contract in its articles 8, 12, as well as the Annex 2, stipulates situations where any potential conflict of interest have to be declared, as well as the fact that if there are going to be any subcontractors which are going to be used, those have to be declared in an annex to the assignment contract, and that has to be approved by the CPVO to ensure that this subcontractor in itself will not create a conflict of interest itself. And it's important here to underline that any subcontracting is still the responsibility of the examination office. It's the examination office that signs the contract with the CPVO. It's not the subcontractor, although there can be a contract between the subcontractor and the examination office. But if there was to be any problem during the course of the technical examination, be it through conflict of interests or any other issue, then it will be the examination office that is answerable to the CPVO, not the subcontractor itself. I also mentioned earlier that there could be the situation of external experts. Those are a panel of experts. They could be from the trade, they could be from researchers from another institute or from a university who have an in-depth knowledge of that species and perhaps many varieties which are circulating in commerce. However, because these people may also be involved in commerce, we have to ensure that they're not going to have a biased opinion on the assistance they're lending to the US examiners. On the one side, these external experts, they're not examiners themselves. They're not making the declaration as to whether a variety is distinct, uniform, or stable. They are only providing advice as to whether the comparison varieties being used in the trial are the correct ones, and perhaps whether the examination office should be making use of other varieties which have not been included in the trial. So in order to ensure that there's not going to be any bias, because it could be that these external experts from the trade are going to be looking at potentially competitive varieties in the trial, we have to ensure that the plant material of the candidate varieties is being coded so that the expert doesn't think, that's my competitor from a few kilometers down the road, so I'm going to make life harder from him. No, we have to avoid that. So the best way to do that is through coding. And as well as the fact that there has to be full transparency in who these experts are. And in order to provide transparency, the examination office has to publish which are the technical external experts who they're going to be making use of. And that's in a way to reflect that there are not going to be any hidden agendas. And if anyone from the public feels that an external expert should be in that role, well, they can make themselves aware to us. Then there's also the insurance that the confidentiality and the independence is going to be adhered to during the process. There's the coding of the plant material, as I said, because it's not only the external experts that may have access to the trial. Any applications of the CPVO are open to objection. So if we do get a third party or an objector coming to visit the trial with the authority of the CPVO and the examination office, we have to ensure that all the other candidate varieties in the trial are fully coded. We don't want people coming into trial and using it as an opportunity to see what's being studied. They just need to be focusing on the varieties which they have a problem with. So coding is a paramount importance for all of the varieties in the trial. And as I've said, we need to control access because these are varieties which are not yet normally available to the public. They've not yet been commercialized. It's like a scientific trial. We don't want the plant material getting into the wrong hands, whether it's from a visitor or from someone in the vicinity. So controlling access and keeping it securely also means proper fencing of the trials and making it as unanimous as possible in order to make sure that these varieties cannot be identified as potential new varieties. Then I mentioned that chapter 14 deals with subcontracting. There is a possibility for examination officers to subcontract, but that also has to be verified by the CPVO. The subcontractor must act as the examination office would and adhere to the entrustment requirements. So they must carry out their part of the DUS test in the same way that the examination office does. There has to be the clear separation of personnel according to their tasks, whether they may be in breeding activities. If they're in breeding activities, they cannot take part in DUS testing activities. And also they must work in an autonomous manner to ensure that independence. So they cannot be influenced by their superiors to shift the result of the DUS test in one way or another. And just like the examination offices, the subcontractors as well, they're subject to being audited by the CPVO. And I can give an example of that. For example, the last assessment which QAS did at the end of last year, which was to Spain, in actual fact, the Spanish examination office, which is based in Madrid, they subcontract out all of the technical examinations to different institutes around the country. So as well as visiting the central office in Madrid, QAS also has to visit in turn each of these different testing institutes to make sure that they are adhering to the entrustment requirements according to the structure of the organization, avoidance of non-conflict of interest, adherence to protocols, etc. So during the visit to Spain, the QS team was accompanied by a representative from the Spanish office in Madrid, as well as examiners and representatives of each of those subcontractors. And once again, to say, why was the person from Madrid present? Because at the end of the day, they are responsible to ensure that the DUS test has been carried out properly at the subcontractor itself. Now, in order to make sure that hopefully there are no nasty surprises that arise when QAS comes every 3 years, the examination office itself also has to have an internal quality control system. So in a similar manner to the QAS, and very often examination officers have taken the entrustment requirements of the CPVO and adapted them internally so that they carry out periodic checks within their own internal structure. This internal checks can be done either through their own staff, which have been trained to carry out audits, or it can be outsourced to a specialist organization which carries out auditing. All this has to be done through document control. There has to be a log of when these audits carry out and what has been looked at, what has been analyzed, whether something needs to be corrected or improved, and as well as that, what corrective action measures have been taken and whether the file has been closed once that corrective action measure has been taken. So it's important that that is done on a regular basis, because QAS will also look into these internal controls to see if the right corrections have been made and implemented. This checklist internally will involve quality management, documentation, records, audits and reviews, corrective action, and reporting. So that is done both internally as well as by QAS. So in a way, it's like a double check by us as well as the examination office itself. Now I'll go into the technical capabilities. It's the kind of nitty-gritty. It's the basis of what the audit is there to achieve. First, we have to look to see whether the examination office has the sufficient infrastructure to carry out the DUS test. So things like land, greenhouses. We see here a DUS trial for chrysanthemum varieties, which is carried out within a greenhouse, whether there's temperature control in the greenhouse, in the fields, like here in a cereals trial, whether there's sufficient land, whether irrigation is being provided in order to ensure that the crops are not lost in case there's drought. Whether also in greenhouses or outside, there's proper protection of the varieties, protection not only through fencing, but also against pests and diseases. That if there was to be an attack by a pathogen or insects, that appropriate protection measures are going to be taken to ensure that there's not going to be a loss of the trial. Also machinery, laboratory facilities, all that kind of thing to ensure that proper records are being taken and that there's not going to be any loss of varieties along the line. Also that the different test protocols and procedures from the CPVO are being applied, because for each species that is being tested, whether it's for cereals, chrysanthemum, or some vegetable crops, as is the case here, they're going to be tested according to the CPVO protocols for each of those species. Each of those protocols has a set of criteria or characteristics which have to be observed for each of the candidate varieties. We need to look into how the office is handling plant material. It's important that they adhere to the rules in the schedule, that they're accepting no less plants than the instructions that have been sent to the applicant prescribe. So if the applicant is told they must deliver 8 plants of an apple variety, they have to deliver 8, not 6. And if they deliver 6, then that is reported to the CPVO, who will then take the necessary action behind. Also, that any necessary phytosanitary documentation is accompanying the plant material, because we have to ensure that it's free of pests and diseases. We do not want to put into danger other varieties which are in the trial, nor in the reference collection. So we will be checking all these things to make sure that the plant material is being accepted in the right conditions. And also, very importantly, the constitution of the variety collections, because the candidate variety is going to be judged against all the varieties of common knowledge within that species. And this the variety collections, in fact, is often the most critical part of the QAS assessment itself. There is not a finite number of varieties in a collection for any given species, because each year there are more and more varieties that are becoming available, and the examination office has an obligation to keep up to date. They have to know what's being registered, what's being marketed, and include that into their variety collection. They will have to describe the varieties which are coming from outside their own trials, so that they can then have a reliable database from which to choose comparison varieties, the most similar varieties, to include in the trial against the candidate varieties themselves. In order to do that, they have to have an inventory of varieties. So they like to have to look to various sources, catalogs, official registers, into the internet to see what's going to be out there. And based upon that, they will form a short list of varieties of common knowledge in which to include into their collection. And once they've included them into their collection, both via physical means through the acquisition of plant material or seeds, they will then have to grow it out to describe it. And once they have it in their collection through plant material and through description, then it can be said that it's a proper accession. And then through those accessions, the selection will be made to include the most similar varieties against the candidate variety in the QAS test. So what to include in the variety collection? Well, it includes all series of varieties, either protected varieties which have been tested elsewhere and protected by the CPVO, or it could be protected varieties which have been protected by other countries, whether inside the EU or overseas. Other commercial varieties or registered varieties in official catalogs. And in some sectors, like in the ornamental sector, where there's no official need to register varieties, the mere fact that it's in commerce makes a variety of common knowledge. So basically everything under the sun has to be considered as a variety of common knowledge, as long as it's accessible to the public. That's why it's very important to constantly update your inventory because it's a never-ending task, and the QAS team will judge that variety collection to see if it's sufficiently complete or not in order to perform correct and reliable DUS tests. There are ways which variety collections can differ. Principally on the method of propagation, whether it's through seeds or vegetative ways. And also we look to see how the examination office utilizes the variety collections through databases, etc., in order to be able to exclude varieties which are not similar, and the way to include varieties which are similar in the QAS test itself. So we'll be looking to see the tools which are being used in the process so that the most similar varieties are actually being utilized in the test. Now I'll go into explain how the QAS assessment in practice is carried out. Well, it's a multi-annual planning because, as I'll show you later, we have many examination offices and not all of them can be audited in 1 year. So there's a multi-annual planning, and then there's an annual planning. Once you decide which offices are going to be visited in any 1 year, we have to put them in a kind of order throughout the year to make the visit most suitable to when the crops will be at the best time to be seen. Then I have to also compose an audit team, formulate the sample, and communicate with the examination office in advance of the audit itself to tell them what we're going to be seeing. Then there'll be the actual on-site visit, the conclusion of the visit together with the report, and an evaluation together with the recommendation. So here we can see in the map that we have 23 examination offices dotted about throughout the European Union. In some countries, like in Italy, we actually have contracts with separate examination offices. In other countries, like in Spain and in France, we have just one examination office which we deal with, although they themselves can have subcontractors. The usual situation is one examination office per country, although not all not all countries have one of our entrusted examination offices. So you see, for example, here in Bulgaria, they do not have any entrusted examination offices. And out of the Baltic countries, only Estonia has an entrusted examination office with a CPVO. So with 23 examination offices, it's not possible to visit them all in 1 year. So that's why we have an assessment cycle of 3 years. And then these 23 offices, they're distributed in the 3 years. So that makes an average of about 8 examination offices to visit in any 1 year. Then once it's decided which 8 or so examination offices are going to be visited in any 1 year, other factors has to be taken into account as regards the risks for any particular examination office, such as the complexity of the examination office, how many species they're entrusted for, whether there's subcontracting being carried out, and any other changes, whether they're personnel changes or personnel in structure and things like that. Then I have to, in particular, where I have to build up a QAS team, I have to match up what the examination office does according to the capabilities of my technical experts. As I showed you earlier, I have 36 technical experts at hand, but they're not all qualified in the same manner. Some are experts in some fields, others are experts in other fields. In particular, in the CPVO, we have 4 main crop sectors, which are agricultural, vegetable, ornamental, and fruit. And not all experts are experts in all those areas. Usually they have a specialization in 1 or 2 sectors. So according to the examination office and the sectors they are involved with, I have to choose the appropriate experts who are also experts in those sectors. I also have to ensure that there's not going to be a conflict of interest with those technical experts. So obviously I can't choose experts from that same examination office, nor experts which have recently been involved in audits to that office. I also try and use all 36 technical experts during a 3-year cycle, so that everyone gets to do something and that they maintain their level of expertise. And obviously, as I just said, I have to optimize that scope of entrustment together with the expert. Here we see the number of experts there are in each crop sector. So we see that in agricultural and vegetable sectors, I have the most number of experts. Sometimes an expert can be an expert in both agriculture and vegetable, because if you add all these figures, you'll say, well, that makes more than 36. It's true, but then some experts, they are multitask. They deal in various crop sectors. Then the examination offices themselves, they can also be specialized in 1 or more sectors. So, for example, the examination offices in Italy, each of those is specialized in 1 sector. But then we have other offices, for example, the ones in France and in Germany, that they're specialized in all of the 4 sectors of the CPVO. And here we have a chart whereby we illustrate the number of species for which the examination offices are entrusted. So we have here in this part those for which they're entrusted for less than 8 species. And here we have the very big offices, which are France, Germany, and the Netherlands, and they are entrusted for more than 300 species. So they're big. They do a lot of examinations for the CPVO. So that's where we have to spend usually more time during the audit. Then I have to decide the kind of species we're going to be looking at, because if I do want to go to one of the big offices, we can't examine all 300 or more species. I have to take a sample, and that sample is based on the testing volume they have for the CPVO. So we have here the different species and the number of trials they've conducted for the CPVO in a 3-year period. So on the one hand, I have to pick big species for sure, but sometimes smaller species to make sure that the smaller species, they're not being forgotten about and that they're still maintaining a high level of expertise. I also have to take into account the changes to the scope of entrustment, whether they've acquired recently new species or not. So all this has to be taken into account. So the different variables are the size of the examination office, the number of test sites, like in Spain, where they have several subcontractors dotted around throughout Spain. Obviously, they can't all be visited in one period of a few days or a week. So we have to say we're going to go to this place and that place, and perhaps 3 years later we go to other places. Then the scope complexity, as we've just seen, how many the crops they have to test, whether they've had new species or not, whether there have been particular incidents that have been reported to the CPVO. It could be incidents about crop losses or potential conflict of interest, which we have to go into in more detail. And we also take into account what's been looked at in previous audits, whether corrective action needs to be verified, or whether we know we've seen the species 3 years later, we don't need to see it again. We'll make sure we look at different species each time. So in order to make an audit effective, we have to announce quite a long time in advance, several months in advance, which dates are going to be identified for the visit itself. The examination office tells QAS team whether there have been structural changes in the examination office. And then nearer the time, we draft a timetable and an agenda for the audit itself. So this is what an agenda looks like, which is shared between the QAS team and the examination office. It has all kinds of elements like the examination office here in Slovakia, when it's going to take place, and then a detailed agenda of where we're going to be according to which time, how much time needs to be allowed to go between different types, when we're going to open the meeting, when we're going to be closing the meeting, and eventual transfers to the airports for the arrival and the departure of the QAS team. And sometimes it helps to add a map so that we can have an illustration of where we need to be where. We have an opening meeting at when we arrive, where we lay out all the basic ground rules of the audit. It's very important at this stage to build rapport with the auditees, because that can influence greatly how much fruitful exchange is going to be had between the auditors and the auditees. Then during the audit itself, we carry out interviews, inspections, analyses, we go into the trial fields, etc. We encourage open questions between both parties. And as we go along, we make our observations, we make notes, and if there were to be any non-conformities, then those are reported at the closing meeting together with a summary of how the actual audit has gone. So the conclusions are presented in the closing meeting. Then the QAS team has to write a report within a period of 12 weeks, together with the corrective action which needs to be taken. And also they are giving a period of about 3 months, the examination office, to make the corrective action. If that is the case, then a follow-up report is made, and that's attached together with the assessment report, which is provided as a recommendation to the Administrative Council so that they can take a decision on entrustment. Here we have some examples of non-conformities, but I'm aware of the time, so perhaps just go pass them by. You'll be able to look at those in the presentation when you receive the slides. As I said, the audit cycle takes 3 years, and at the end of the 3 years, we look to see areas for improvement, either through revision of the entrustment requirements that we're doing now, or ways in which we can improve efficiencies of the QAS team itself, like do we need up to 12 weeks to make the assessment report? Perhaps no, perhaps we can do it in a shorter time span, plus ways of other improvements which can be made to the system. We also undertake regular training, and we also take the opportunity to update our procedural manual, including the ways of appointing the technical experts and the audit advisory board. Now I have several slides for the examination offices and technically qualified bodies, but I see we're running out of time, and they can be quite complex. So I'll give you the opportunity to look at them through the presentation once you receive this. Just to say that the examination office can decide to do their own testing or subcontract out to the technically qualified body. It should be agreed upon by the CPVO and the examination office. As I said earlier, all the acts performed by the subcontractor, it's as if they were acts performed by the examination office itself. The same regulations and rules, as I stated earlier, apply to the technical qualified bodies as they do for the examination offices. The same articles, Article 56 and Article 15. They have to be stated in the designation agreement. The final responsibility is with the examination office. The legal requirements. The same conflict of interest issues are also applicable to the subcontractors, the technically qualified bodies. So we have to, this is particularly important because very often these technically qualified bodies, they are institutes which carry out research or breeding. Very often we can only utilize such institutes because they are the only ones that have sufficiently complete variety collection. So it's a necessary, I wouldn't call it a necessary evil, but it's the only option we have. But seeing as it's the only option we have to avoid that there could be any potential conflict of interest. Then I will just skip this. The confidentiality is the same as for the examination office. We have to ensure that all the plants are coded, that the plant material is not going to be used for any other purpose other than the test itself, and that no third parties are going to be allowed access to the trials unless approved of by the CPVO. This just goes on to more legal text. And well, for the conflict of interests, I already mentioned it in my earlier slides, so I'll just whiz through this. Just to state briefly that we can also have cooperation with examination offices outside the European Union. And that's particularly in situations where we do not have DUS testing capabilities inside the European Union for certain species. That certain species are, shall we say, usually of a kind of tropical nature, where because of the European Union climates, we're not able to test things which may be coming from the tropics, which are so exotic that there just isn't a variety collection inside the European Union. So in those cases, we have to go to the Administrative Council to get their approval that we can test that species through a third-party organization. In order to do so, we have to go through a similar procedure to the designation agreement, but it's in a lighter form. We have a separate contract where the examination office outside the EU has to illustrate who are their contact persons, that they can ensure the independence, impartiality, and non-conflict of interest, that they have the correct facilities and equipment to carry out the DUS test, as well as prior experience in that particular species, and that they're using either UPOV guidelines or national protocols in order to conduct the test in a correct manner. Then our agreement also lays out things on how to maintain the variety collections, the right for the CPVO to visit the trials if ever we get the occasion to travel to other parts of the world. It also has to state what kind of plant material is going to be tested and how that plant material is going to be compared against the most similar varieties in the collection. Part of the designation of that is also a review by QAS that there's not going to be any impediments, any possible conflicts of interest in the use of this outside examination office. So for that, we also have a view to ensure that the DUS test outside the EU is going to be on a comparable level to a test which would be undertaken inside the EU. Also, it's important because very often it's more difficult outside the European Union to have institutes which do not carry out any breeding or research to also do DUS tests. Very often it's institutes themselves which have done DUS, the breeding of varieties. Of paramount importance is to ensure that there is that avoidance of conflict of interest. And QAS also is involved in outreach activities. In actual fact, in just a couple of weeks' time, I will be going to the Dominican Republic to help the authorities there set up DUS testing in a way that will avoid any potential conflict of interest. Because it could be that in the future, we may need to revert to the Dominican Republic or other countries outside the EU in order that they do DUS tests for us, or we can acquire DUS test results from us. So we are open also to help other authorities in ensuring efficient DUS tests, both from a technical, but from a legal side as well, to ensure that there will be no conflict of interest. We can also get the situation where the DUS test is not subcontracted to another institute, but that it's done at the breeder's premises, either at the breeder's premises inside the European Union or at the breeder's premises outside the European Union, because they may be the only ones that have a sufficient variety collection. So if that's the case, then there also has to be a very detailed series of rules which have to be adhered to. The designation is done in a similar way to what I have just been described for other examination offices outside the European Unions. There has to be a special protocol which needs to be filled in by the examination office, because even though the test is going to be carried out at the breeder's premises, it's going to be surveyed throughout the procedure by a designated examination office for that particular test. So it will usually be personnel from the examination office that go to the breeder's premises, and they will be making the observations on the candidate varieties. The growing itself of the test will be done by the breeder, but under a certain set of conditions, and it will be the examination office itself that will be making the observations. That will ensure the neutrality of the whole procedure, because obviously the breeder is going to be somewhat biased. He will naturally want his variety to pass the test, but we want to ensure that neutrality from an outside person who has not created the variety. So the role of the examination office is to design the trials, label the samples to make sure that you're not going to be identify which variety is which, make the observations according to the guidelines, and report to the CPVO on the results of the trial. Whereas the breeder's role is to ensure that the trial is being conducted in a proper manner, that he's not going to apply certain treatments which may influence the performance of the trial, or that one variety will be declared distinct or not, and whether any problems may have arisen through plants being damaged or through any other external environmental factor. So just to summarize the role of the examination office and the CPVO in this whole DUS testing procedure, well, the examination office has to elaborate the various submission requirements. It has to undertake the technical examination itself, report to the CPVO, and perhaps the thing which is most complex, maintain and update the variety collection so that it's always reflecting the reality of what's happening in the world out there. The CPVO administers the EU system. It communicates with the applicant. It's the coordinator between the breeder and the examination office. It deals with all the instructions, and it liaises with the breeder and the examination office. It takes its decisions on the applications, and for most cases, fortunately, we do deliver a title of protection, and also we take care of all the payments. The breeder pays the CPVO for the DUS test and for the application, and then we transfer the payment of the DUS test directly to the examination office. So part of administering the EU system is the quality audit system itself. So I will conclude on this webinar in the fact that the QAS assessments, which are an integral part of the EU plant variety systems, it's helped improve the quality of the DUS tests. Because we have 23 examination offices inside the European Union, we need to ensure that they are harmonized, that the way the tests are carried out are on a similar level. And with each cycle, we try to raise the level more and more. We revise our entrustment requirements. We take pride on the fact that we think that the EU system is the highest, probably the highest quality system throughout the whole world. And that needs to be so because we're working with 23 different examination offices. QAS is also very important to ensure the independence and credibility in the performance of that DUS test, because those 23 examination offices, they have different structures. Some of them do purely DUS tests, others have subcontractors, and others are involved partly in research and so on. So we have to ensure the neutrality for each of those DUS tests and that there's not going to be any conflict of interest. At the same time, there is that flexibility to allow the subcontracting of the work if that will be a necessity. So with that, I just like to leave you with this thought, because in a way, yes, QAS is a bit like a detective. We're always looking for clues, looking to see where there may be problems, but we're not looking for problems. We always go to our examination office saying, we're not looking to punish you, we're looking to raise the bar, we're looking to help you improve. And sometimes the fact that we are there can help the examination office get funding for new facilities and so on, in order that they can remain at a high quality. So we're not looking at in the traditional role of auditing, but we're looking at in a way that you're able to perform and you're able to do it in a better way and raise your quality throughout to the benefit of everyone. So with that, I would like to thank you very much, and I am open to any questions which you may have.
Thanks to you very, very much for the interesting and clear presentation, Sergio. I have gathered up until now one question, which I am going to show on the screen now. If you allow me, I'll take 1 second really briefly, because some participants have connected themselves a little bit later and might be a little bit insecure about when they're going to receive the slides and the recording. That's going to happen tomorrow morning, just to answer this question in case you were wondering. And this second question from Fabio instead is directed to you, Sergio, so I'll leave it.
Yes, thank you, Fabio, for your question. What's the difference between a subcontractor and a TQB? Well, in essence, they're the same thing. TQB, or Technically Qualified Body, is our formal term for any body or institution which is used by an examination office to carry out all or part of the examination. So it's a subcontractor of the examination office. So subcontractor equals technically qualified body. In the case of Spain, I mentioned earlier, the Spanish examination office, OEVV in Madrid, they solely use subcontractors. So they solely use technically qualified bodies. They have about a dozen different technically qualified bodies. The main one they use, which is INEA, deals mainly in agricultural and vegetable crops, and they have different testing stations throughout Spain. And then they have more specialized technically qualified bodies, which deal, for example, in citrus. There's one in Valencia in citrus. There's another one which I visited just 6 months ago in Cordoba, which only deals in olive. So they can be a specialized subcontractor. There are also other situations where the examination office may do most of the US test, but there are certain characteristics, an example of which, for example, is cotton, where the examination office does, say, 95% of the characteristics, but then there are some characteristics linked with fiber for which specialized laboratories and equipment are required, where they may not have them. So they can subcontract out the characteristics for fiber to a technically qualified body who will do them under confidential situations, so under coding, etc. So hopefully that has answered your question.
Thank you for the answer, and thank you, Fabio, also for the question. At the moment, I do not have any other question. While participants perhaps think about potential questions you might have, I'd like also to remind that in case questions should pop out, for example, after the webinar has taken place, or this afternoon, you can refer also in writing to the European IP Help Desk helpline, and we will provide you as soon as possible, as I told you before, with an answer to your specific question, perhaps also referring to the CPVO help. Fabio is thanking you, Sergio, for the answer. Otherwise, I don't have any more questions in the question part of the screen. It is also noon right now, so we are perfectly actually on time with the presentation. And I would say that if nobody else is typing as it is, I would now close this session, close the webinar. Also thanking very much Sergio Simon for being with us and for the interesting presentation. I hope we'll have a chance to carry out another webinar in the future and in the second part of the year as well. And thank you very much to all participants for having shared this morning together with us. For me, it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you from my side once again, and thank you also for all your interest. So I'm glad to be here and hopefully see you in the future.
Very good. Thanks again. Thank you, everyone, and have a very lovely afternoon. Goodbye from the European IP Help Desk and from the CPVO.
Goodbye. Thank you.